David French, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, before we jump into this, I have to give a shout out to one of our listeners, Carrie Lynn Paulson. So last time you were on the show in August, she tweeted and she petitions to have at least one Friday per month be French Friday on the Holy Post. And I told her I'm in on Twitter, and then you jumped in and said, sure. So Carrie Lynn, thank you for the suggestion. That's why David's back with us, and hopefully he'll be back on maybe a monthly basis if we can do this. And in honor of your suggestion, Carrie Lynn, we are calling this French Friday.
I even saw an emailed logo for it. I mean, that's
Yeah,
pretty incredible.
we're still working on the details, but I wanted to give you a preview. So there will be a special logo. And if you get really fortunate, David, Phil might actually compose your own ukulele theme song.
No, I mean that's too much for anybody to hope. I mean, you really
He's
you
been
really
very
can't.
busy lately. He's been very busy, but you never know when inspiration will strike.
Guess what day it is? Oh, it's French Friday, it's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
Okay, we're going to hit a number of different topics today, but let's start with the most current thing going on, which is a number of people have been asking me online about the SBC Executive Committee. That's kind of news that just hit this week of what's going on. I haven't followed it super closely. There was a report in Religion News Service today that kind of gave some details of what's happened in this new meeting. But it begins back in the summer when the SBC had their big convention, and the witnesses, which is their name for all their member delegates from all the different churches around the country, came together,
Messengers.
and they voted and called upon the executive committee to hire a third party, or they hired a third party to investigate the sexual abuse and its potential cover-ups. And they called for the executive committee of the SBC to waive immunity in this investigation. You're a lawyer. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So essentially, what they're wanting is there to be this independent investigation, and the independent investigation will be investigators will be allowed to look at everything, including attorney-client, what would be traditionally attorney-client privilege documents. So, what are the deliberations that SBC executive committee members had with attorneys? Now, this is a big step, and it's something that a lot of folks, me included, who have taken a close look at a lot of abuse issues, have been calling for ministries to do if they want to find out the facts to do justice for victims. And there's a pretty important reason why you would do this, and that is, uh, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm just gonna go ahead and just dump all over my own profession. A lot of times what happens is that when you have a ministry under fire or a ministry organization under fire, a lot of the people who are under fire are either not used to it, they're panicked, they're afraid, they don't know what's going to happen to the ministry, and in comes the lawyer on the white horse. And the lawyer's job is not to do justice. Okay, that is not the lawyer's job. The lawyer's job is to protect the interests of the lawyer's client, the interests of the ministry.
Right.
And now a really good lawyer will say, if you do X, well, you can preserve your financial assets, but you might not preserve your reputation. And oh, by the way, also, you guys have a purpose in your ministry that is above and beyond, say, preserving your financial assets. But in a lot of, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of panic, sometimes because they just don't know what to do, a lot of these institutions, it's almost as if they cede crisis response to the legal team. And so what ends up happening is you have a pile of communications. A lot of people say things that they're really true that they say to their lawyer they wouldn't say to anyone else. And so it's one of those things. I forget the show that says the truth is out there.
Oh, X-Files?
X-Files, yes,
Yeah.
X-Files. So the truth is out there, and it's often hidden in these attorney-client privileged document files. And so if you're a ministry and you have people who have been abused, you have abuse allegations, and you have this higher purpose. You have a higher purpose. You're part of the body of Christ. You're not a company that's trying to preserve a bottom line. You can't act like the company that's trying to preserve the bottom line. And so, what the messengers of the SBC did is say, hey, we want to know it all. We want the dirty laundry aired out. We want it all aired out. And then it gets to the executive committee, and the executive committee hasn't exactly done that yet. It's all still in a state of flux. It's a complicated situation. But that's what's going on. Essentially, what the messenger said is we want maximum transparency, even if that means maximum vulnerability, because that's what waiving attorney-client privilege means.
Right. I think I called them witnesses earlier. They're messengers. My bad. There's a question. I don't know that much about SBC polity here, but when the messengers voted in the summer and called upon the executive committee to do this, is that in any way binding? Can the executive committee choose not to waive its executive or waive its immunity?
Well, you're asking a PCA person about this.
We're both in the dark.
Yeah, so I'm going to punt a little bit about that. I'm going to say,
Okay.
look, if the executive committee felt completely bound by it, would they have taken the action that they'd taken? Then I would say that the answer to that is no. But you might want to bring on an SBC canon lawyer, although there's no such thing.
Yeah. You mentioned appropriately that unlike a business, a ministry or a denomination or a church is not primarily interested in preserving the bottom line. In my time in ministry, however, nothing happens without trust.
Right.
Nothing is capable without trust and leadership. From your cheap seat and my cheap seat, do you perceive the SBC leadership in trouble here if they don't waive their immunity, in that it would erode so much trust that they're undermining their own ability to lead?
Yeah, I would say in trouble, yes. Doomed remains to be seen. I mean, because there's a difference between in trouble and doomed. There's a difference that there would have to be follow through. There would have to be a prolonged commitment to see real change for something like that to happen. And the SBC, it has a annual convention, but it is not in the kind of situation where there's some sort of immediate ability. Again, I'm not a Baptist canon lawyer, but the ability of there to be some sort of immediate repercussion, immediate response to this seems to be somewhat limited. Like so many of our institutions, trust is not only it. There's no way around character. There's no way around a degree of trust. And so if a leadership body abdicates trust or forfeits trust and a leadership body lacks character, often there are not good remedies for that.
Right.
And that's one of the things that we find not just in the Christian world, but across the political world, the secular world, is that once character is degraded, we often find that we don't have adequate tools to deal very well with the loss of character.
Indeed. I think that's part of the reason why the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast has been so popular. It isn't,
Yeah.
some people call it failure porn or, just staring at a train wreck. I don't think that entirely explains it. I think what it is, it's an extreme example of a very abusive church system, but I think it resonates with so many people because they've experienced it in the institutions they've been a part of, maybe not to the same degree, but they recognize it. And
Yes.
there has been so much loss of trust in all kinds of institutions and incredibly difficult to rebuild. Okay, as a lawyer, let me ask you this, and then we can maybe move on to other stuff. Can you think of any legitimate or good reason why a ministry wouldn't waive immunity?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, so attorney-client privilege it exists in law and has existed in law for a lot of really good reasons.
Yeah.
And that is, sometimes you want to be able to have an absolutely candid conversation and have a conversation in a way where you can be transparent and you can be vulnerable without it being used against you.
Of course.
And so that's the reason for attorney-client privilege. Our judicial system our judicial system would break to pieces if we didn't have attorney-client privilege. So there are circumstances, particularly when you have active ongoing litigation, for example, where you would want to think long and hard about this. But one of the things that we're talking about here is denominational oversight, institutional governance at a large scale, okay? At a large scale. And what you're weighing here is the trust, the character, the actions of the largest denomination in American Protestant Christianity, okay? Including some of the most important, most influential, importance is a different word, but most influential people in American Christianity. And in that circumstance, after trust has been degraded as thoroughly as it has been degraded, there are sometimes you have to take measures you wouldn't ordinarily take to rebuild trust.
Mm-hmm.
So to say that you should always waive attorney-client privilege in all circumstances, I think that's going too far. Here's one thing that I do think a Christian ministry should say is we're not going to bind victims of sexual misconduct to non-disclosure agreements, period.
Yeah.
We're not going to bind them to non-disclosure agreements because here's what ends up happening. On one end, you'll have attorney-client privilege. On the other end, you have non-disclosure agreements. And then you have a congregation with no access to the truth at all.
Right.
And so that in many ways is the worst possible situation. But here, when you have extraordinary circumstances, extraordinary loss of trust, extraordinary importance of the institution, that's 3 extraordinaries by my count, then it's time to think about extraordinary remedies and extraordinary ways to rebuild trust. And that's when I think, for example, a waiver of attorney-client privilege so that you're an open book can be really important. I would never say in every circumstance, attorney-client privilege in a Christian ministry is a bad idea. I would never say that. I would say in circumstances like this, it's wise.
Okay, I thought of one more thing before we move on. Hypothetically, if the executive committee of the SBC did waive its immunity and privilege with their attorneys, who would be open to liability if something were to be found that was damning? Would it be the SBC itself, or could individual officers of the executive committee also be liable for actions they took or cover-ups they may have done?
Yes.
Both. Okay.
It depends. It all depends on what's disclosed. So, you could have disclosures of people who are acting in what's called their individual capacity. That you have John Smith, not in any professional capacity, committed some sort of, violated the rights of Jane Johnson, and that would be exposed and there could be liability. So you can have an individual liability situation, but you can also have a situation in which it's revealed that people acting in their institutional capacities, acting as whether it's a pastor of a church or acting as a member of the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, makes an institutional act or takes institutional actions in that capacity as an institutional actor. So it really depends on the specific facts. So again, that's another reason why if you're in the executive committee and there's some bad stuff out there, waiving attorney-client privilege is a big, big, big deal. It's a big deal institutionally. It's a big deal individually, but that's, this transparency, this radical transparency is what the denomination demanded.
And is this something that can only be done um, in one big swoop, or can it be done piecemeal? In other words, could individual officers say, "I personally waive my attorney-client privilege," even if the whole group doesn't?
So piecemeal is tough, and here's why. So there's kind of an idea about attorney-client privilege that it's a sort of an all or nothing thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't use it in the sort of the legal phrase would be as a sword and as a shield. So in other words, hey, look, I'm going to send you this communication that makes me look great. And then there's this other communication that doesn't make me look so great, and I'm not disclosing that. Now, if it's an individual acting entirely as in their individual capacity, I mean, that's sort of their own individual all or nothing decision. But
Sure.
institutions kind of have to have an institutional all or nothing kind of action. Otherwise, you run into that sword and shield problem, so that anybody who sort of came along afterwards and sued afterwards said, that partial waiver, that you can't do that. You can't do that.
Mm.
It's one reason why if you're ever in litigation, and if you've ever been in litigation, it's one reason why lawyers are such sticklers for attorney-client privilege, because We know if we give an inch on that, we've given a mile. And so that's so we, no one should underplay the gravity of this. This is a big deal. But as I said, extraordinary circumstances sometimes call for extraordinary remedies.
Indeed. And since this is a moving target, maybe we'll revisit this in a future conversation as the SBC ends up making more decisions. But it is an important story. Okay, I want to go on to something you wrote last week or this past week about the nature of the evangelical label.
Oh, yeah.
You wrote a piece in your French press column called "Did Donald Trump Make the Church Great Again?" And it's based on recent Pew data that's come out that shows a lot of people predicted after 2016 that there was going to be this mass exodus of evangelicals
Right.
because the label and the community being so tainted by its association with Donald Trump and political ideas and things like that. But it showed actually just the opposite, that there's no mass exodus. And in fact, the number of people who self-identify as evangelicals has grown since 2016, which launched you into this whole broader conversation about the nature of this identity. So
Right.
let's start here. Do you still openly call yourself an evangelical?
I do.
And
I do.
why? What do you mean by it, and why do you still believe in using it?
Yeah, I have. So I grew up in a much more fundamentalist background. So I grew up in what everybody from the outside would call an absolutely fundamentalist church. Although we on the inside did not say we're fundamentalist, but
Sure.
I grew up in a fundamentalist background, and I was keenly aware of a difference between fundamentalism and evangelicalism. Um, Reminds me of the Holy Post that you and Phil did, where you did sort of this Bob Jones Wheaton paradigm.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was, although I didn't grow up Baptist, I would have grown up in that tradition that was more the Bob Jones side than the Wheaton side. And so for me, the walk into evangelicalism was a very important part of my life, and a very important part of my walk with the Lord was walking into evangelicalism. And so it's an idea, it's a concept that I think has real value and real meaning. Okay. And so I don't want to give up so much on that word. And I think it especially has meaning as we're beginning to see the struggle, not to go back to the SBC again, but between evangelicalism and neo-fundamentalism. And theologically and culturally, these are two different and sort of colliding forces. But the reason why I don't emphatically immediately say, yeah, evangelical, is because it's also an exit poll category. It's not just a sort of a statement of theology and beliefs that is broadly ecumenical traditional Christianity. It is quite simply a coalitional way, a way of categorizing people in political coalitions. And that is what I tried to demonstrate in my piece is, wait a minute, we got a real issue with the word itself, and that the way people talk about evangelical in the political context is increasingly including a giant number of people who never or hardly ever go to church. Um, and then there's a partisan divide on that as well. So if you're a Protestant Republican and you go to church once a year, that's not even a Christmas Easter Christian. That's a Christmas or Easter Christian. 2/3 of those folks call themselves evangelical. So 2/3 of the folks who go to church once a year. And now more than half of people who self-identify as evangelical go to church monthly or less. Okay, so evangelical is obviously meaning something that is a lot different from a theological or even sort of a church-going category. And so that's why, we have a real issue with that word
We
right
do.
now, a real issue.
Yeah, and our debate about this goes all the way back to 2012 when we first started
Right.
the Holy Post. We've been talking about this for a long, long time. Okay, let me back up for a second. You said something interesting about your upbringing.
Mhm.
You come from what you describe as a fundamentalist community, but you would have never called yourselves fundamentalists at the
Right.
time. Okay. And then you fast forward to some of the dynamics we see within the SBC and in numerous other denominations right now, where there seems to be this growing divide between what you are calling evangelicals and neo-fundamentalists.
Mhm.
In my experience, I totally agree with you, by the way, but in my experience, those neo-fundamentalists don't call themselves
No.
neo-fundamentalists.
No.
Everyone still calls themselves an evangelical.
Yeah.
So that's part of the difficulty here is the term is used so many different ways, and it feels like it's so squishy because it doesn't have its boundaries defined anymore, or the boundaries that are used are cultural 1 minute, political another minute,
Yeah.
theological another minute, and at that point the language fails to be useful.
Right. No, it really does, and a lot of it depends on who are you talking to at the same
Sure.
time. So, if you and I are talking and we've both been thinking through these issues, and talking about these issues for a really long time, well, then we could quickly move to other language that we could use to describe ourselves. We would understand each other and we would sort of know where we stood. But let's say I'm talking to somebody who is just discovering my work and they consider themselves an evangelical Christian. They're a member of a Baptist church or a PCA church or maybe Assemblies of God or whatever, and non denominational, and they consider themselves evangelical. The instant I say I'm not evangelical, okay, what is the first thing that they think? Well, I've fallen away from the faith.
Sure.
And so I'm not someone that they would want to hear from, right? And so it's a very interesting. So we have a lot of these really interesting debates over what should the word actually mean that are conducted at a really high level. And then there's another kind of common consensus of what it means within the ranks of actual church-going evangelicals. And then there's a third marker amongst an awful lot of highly political non-church-going folks that simply says, I'm a conservative and a Christian, or I'm a Republican, or more specifically, I'm a Republican and a Christian.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it depends on how I describe myself as who am I talking to here? Who's my audience?
Right. Yeah. In your piece, you do a really helpful job of you talk about three buckets, these three buckets
Mhm.
of evangelicals, which are the three you just mentioned. But the one that's really at play in the article and accounts for Pew's numbers
Yeah.
is, at least in your article, it's the second bucket. And
Yeah.
you describe them this way, just to reiterate it. They're self-identified white evangelicals who are the core constituency of the Republican Party. This group of Americans is religiously heterodox and ideologically uniform. This is the group of evangelical Americans who receive the lion's share of the nation's attention precisely because they represent the key to Republican power in the United States. Without white evangelicals, the GOP would effectively cease to exist. So they're not, and you go on to say that they're largely biblically illiterate, right? They're not
Yeah.
following the teachings of Jesus Christ. They're not highly engaged in a local church community or congregation. They are culturally white, conservative, Republican, probably Trump supporting, nominally Christian people,
Right.
right? But they still call themselves evangelical.
Still call themselves like evangelical. And they're
Okay,
also allied with sort of the neo-fundamentalists who are super church going,
right.
and highly politicized in their religion. But yes, that when you hear newscasters say the word evangelical, what they're typically referring to is white, self-identified evangelicals.
Yeah.
In
So
other words, the exit poll question.
and you appropriately juxtapose that with where you would probably put yourself and where I'd put myself, which are
Right.
the historically defined theological evangelicals and Bevington's quadrilateral and all that sort of stuff. Here's the thing. For years and years, I've been debating, how do we better differentiate those two groups, right?
Right.
And my instinct has been, well, maybe I need a new label, right? Maybe there's a different label I should be using, and
Right.
it's not worked. It doesn't work. So I think we need a new. I think we need a new label for those conservative, political, non-church going, biblically illiterate so-called evangelicals, the ones that the newscasters use. So I have some ideas, and I want to get
Okay.
your thought on any of these to see if they work. Um, Bible Trumpers. How about the moral deplority?
I'm I'm seeing some problems already.
Evangelofascists.
I'm seeing some problems.
How about post-Jesus people? I think that's kind of accurate. Crypto Christians. That's actually got some history behind it, but I like it because it's kind of like the currency. It's
Right.
very popular, but it has nothing behind it. Um, how about fear evangelicals? That's one I've used before. Um, my favorite though is promise creepers. I think any of those would be acceptable alternatives to just using the word evangelical because it's way too confusing out there. But
Oh,
do
it's
you
so
think at some
confusing.
point this will self-correct itself? Will we have a clearly differentiated identity between these groups, or is it going to be muddled forever? Because I feel like the good, not the good evangelicals, but the theologically rooted evangelicals are being dragged down by this weight of what they don't stand for.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, one of the realities that we're dealing with, and my colleague Chris Starwalt was just on a podcast with my other colleague Jonah Goldberg, and they were talking about this very issue. And Chris Starwalt has been, a political analyst for decades and has looked at this. And basically, what we're a victim of is a certain polling reality. And that is that if you take a segment of white people and you add this kind of identifier, you have a coalition of people who vote as a block. And it becomes a very helpful way of analyzing politics. And the sad thing, I think, honestly, Skye, if you want me to be sort of pessimistic and cynical about this, is so long as that word has uses beyond the Christian church to help analyze American political and cultural trends, we're going to be stuck with it. And the other reason why we're going to be stuck with it is not only is it helpful, the phrase white evangelicals helpful to pollsters and analysts and things like that, the word evangelical still has enough goodwill attached to it within the larger, sort of within the larger religious culture that people aren't, and this is one of the interesting things about the Pew finding, people aren't really running from that word.
Hmm.
So people aren't running from it. And if you're someone like you or me, where, you could pass the Barna test, or you match with the Bebbington quadrilateral, your evangelicalism is irrelevant to your identity as a Democrat or Republican. You're in, wherever the Republican Party is or the Democratic Party is irrelevant to your theological point of view. And so it makes sense for you to not go anywhere. It makes sense for me to not go anywhere. But at the same time, as soon as that word becomes steeped in partisan politics for a certain category of Republican, it makes sense for them to join that team.
Right. I
Yeah.
agree completely. The problem is, like, if I were to get a survey from a Pew or wherever and it listed various religious identities, I don't have anywhere to go. There's no
Right.
alternative. So is that part of what we're seeing in these numbers is you and I, who are historical evangelicals, are still going to check that box. And then we have new people coming in to check that box because they're white Republican conservative
Yeah.
Trump supporters. But it's a inaccurate portrayal, because if there were a really good alternative for you and I, we would have picked it. And
What I would like to see is stop having the only box in the exit poll category white evangelical.
Mhm.
Because what that creates is it creates confusion. Because in the three buckets I had was, one is evangelicals of all ethnicities, and races.
Right.
Okay, that self-described. In other
There's
words,
a
if you're
lot of
going to
people of color who hold evangelical theological convictions.
correct, and they are not politically uniform with the Republican Party. In
Right.
fact, it flips around. They're about 70-30 not Republican. Okay. And then if you have the Bebbington's quadrilateral or Barna people, they're sort of a minority of a minority, maybe about 6 or 7% of the whole country. But they're also multi-ethnic and people of different races, and far less uniformly Republican than the white evangelical world. So I would like to see the polling questions not jamming people of faith into white evangelical and born again and other.
Yeah.
You might begin to see, and I think the wider public would begin to see the diversity of the American Christian community more clearly. And I think it would also be instructive for a lot of white evangelicals who are going to 98% white churches and sort of experiencing Christianity and republicanism as sort of synonymous with each other, it could help perhaps open up some eyes.
Is part of the problem that these large polling organizations are too beholden to political categories, and therefore they present what's useful to a political activist rather than what might actually be most useful to the rest of us?
They're not sociologists. Well, I mean, there might be sociologists who are political pollsters, but a political pollster is not necessarily a social scientist in the same way
Hmm.
that somebody who's trying to deeply study the sociology of American religion. And so they're not going to ask questions that you and I would find most helpful to figure out American
Yeah.
Christianity. They're going to ask questions that are most helpful for them to figure out political coalitions. And then the problem comes once you have a set of questions, there's a lot of interest in keeping those questions the same year after year after year after year.
Right.
So you can plot the growth or contraction of specific political constituencies. But it's that combination of the exit poll definition, which is not a real definition of evangelicalism, and the theological definition, which is a real definition, that creates so much confusion.
Yeah. What worried me about this Pew study when I first saw it was how people might misinterpret it, or at least
Yeah.
nefariously utilize it. Like this, I could see this being used by a Donald Trump or someone in his camp to say, "See, he's been great for the church. He's grown the numbers. He hasn't hurt the credibility of the faith whatsoever. So all those critics need to just sit down and shut up." But if you actually dig into the numbers, none of that is necessarily accurate.
Right, right. Well, the bottom line is that when you're dealing with the category of self-described evangelical, in other words, the only test of whether or not you're an evangelical is if you tell someone you are, that is increasingly not a religious marker.
Yeah.
It is increasingly, especially in white America, it is increasingly a political marker. To know the religious identity of a person, you have to ask more questions.
Yeah. And Ryan Burge has said essentially the same thing
Totally. Yeah.
and that's my hesitation in self-identifying as an evangelical. You brought up the wise point that it depends who you're talking to. It depends on
Mhm.
the audience. But in so many places where I go, if I identify as an evangelical, the assumption of my audience or the person I'm engaging with is immediately cultural and political. It's
Yeah.
not theological or
Yeah.
historical, and that's why I find it so unhelpful. But I don't have an alternative.
Yeah. I test drove Presbyterian.
Hmm.
I did test drive that for a while. And what I realized is if you're in more conservative circles and you say Presbyterian, unless you immediately follow it with PCA,
Yeah.
they're going to think PCUSA, which Presbyterian, but has very different sort of, it's in a very different place from the PCA. And so it's really interesting. Maybe, that could be a great Holy Post listener suggestion box question.
What alternative label would you propose? Let's move on to at least one more thing, and that is a piece you wrote a few weeks ago titled "The American Crisis of Selective Empathy." And by the way, for those of you who don't know, David writes for the Dispatch, and you have regular columns under the French press subcategory.
Yes.
And if you're not a subscriber, please sign up. I am a subscriber. I benefit from your writing multiple times a week, as well as your podcast. So your content is fantastic. And it's not just, theological or Christian. You get into politics and legal matters. And we've geeked out a little bit about your Advisory Opinions podcast before, and continue to love and learn a lot from that. But our conversations today are largely circling around your religious writing. The American Crisis of Selective Empathy. Begin by talking about your friend who shared on Facebook, who's non-political, about the COVID mess and how that
Yeah.
led you into this conversation about empathy.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. One, seeing people around me, because I'm in I think until about 2 or 3 days ago, Tennessee was the epicenter of the Delta variant in the US. More deaths per million, more cases per million, more hospitalizations per million. And so a lot of people are dying in my community. who could have been vaccinated chose not to be vaccinated. And what's happening is you're seeing an awful lot of people. There's a profoundly mixed reaction to that. There are people who are deeply grieved by it. And there are people who are, to use a phrase from Elizabeth Brunig, death shaming, including getting just outright cruel, like thinning the herd kind of comments.
Right.
And a friend of mine, he's staunchly Republican, dear friend going back to freshman year of college, staunchly Republican, but not political. He doesn't post much. He just had this really heartfelt post on Facebook, and he says, I don't post political things. Today I'm simply sad. And he said, I'm sad because I attended a funeral yesterday due to COVID, and I could have attended a second one. Otherwise healthy people who could have been vaccinated. He just poured his heart out, just begging his friends, begging his neighbors to get vaccinated. And I remember putting that with his permission up on Twitter, and again, getting some of this, kind of almost mockery. And I am completely pro-vaccine. But the idea of I'll tell you what breaks my heart so much is the idea of, imagine sitting in a hospital room and it is dawning on you that you're dying. It is dawning on your wife. It is dawning on your children. And it is simultaneously dawning on them that this didn't have to happen. And the shattering realization of that, just the utterly shattering, despair-inducing realization of that. And I said, you know what? We've got to be able to dive into that, dive in with them and be with them, holding them and empathizing with them and weeping with those who weep. And all of this about woulda, coulda, shoulda, thinning the herd, death shaming, all of that stuff needs to take a break when you're talking about these people who are in this ultimate horrible situation of death and despair. And so, that was my entree into empathy. And I have a very ideologically mixed audience. It's not all conservative Christians. It's not all progressives. It's a big mix: Christian, secular, conservative, progressive. And that opening story, that opening anecdote was actually really polarizing, Skye.
How so? What kind of response did you get?
A lot of people saying, no, I'm all out of empathy for these guys.
Yeah.
I'm all out of empathy. I mean, they've known for more than a year, they're taking up hospital beds, and just, I'm all out of empathy. And I would say 90% of the negative feedback I got from the piece was, I'm all out of empathy. The other 10% was people who are out of empathy from a different perspective, kind of buying into the sin of empathy concept that has been bandied about in some circles.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Here's my struggle. I hope I still have capacity for empathy for somebody in the situation like you describe.
Right.
Where I find empathy much, much harder to cultivate is for those voices that are intentionally leading people astray by communicating lies, by sowing distrust in vaccines or other medical authorities. Like, there are people profiting off of this pandemic and pushing lies and untruths that are killing people. And that's where I really I mean, somebody who buys into one of those sources of misinformation, they've been led astray, and I do have great empathy for them and their families. Those who are pushing the disinformation, oh man, the justice in me has a harder time being tolerant of that.
Well, we also have to recognize, when empathy is appropriate, when empathy is not. So, for example, let's just take it out of the COVID situation. If someone says to you, man, my bank robbery was stressful today. You're not diving into the empathy of that stress, right? I mean,
maybe it's Robin Hood.
So we have to, when we're talking about empathy, we're talking about situations in which people are suffering. It's funny, somebody came back to me and said, well, where's the prophetic voice if you're advocating empathy? So Nathan approaches David, right, after Bathsheba and says, and tells the story. And well, the response is, what did Nathan do? Nathan activated in David empathy for this sort of fictional person who had been done had been, an injustice had been committed upon him. And then Nathan says, that's you. And because David had inhabited that, the empathy for that person, that fictional person that Nathan created, it struck him like a thunderbolt. And so, one of the things about a virtue of empathy is that, different situations, of course, call forth and require different responses. But at the same time, even the most heinous of people, can suffer immensely. And there are times, just to take this as far as it'll go, there's this fight right now in Texas over whether or not a condemned man can have a pastor with him in the execution chamber,
Yep.
laying hands on him and praying, or just merely praying out loud for him as he is executed. And I feel like a Christian can say, I want that person at that ultimate moment of his life. And to that fear, that terror, that person's maybe that fear and terror of meeting your maker, and to empathize for a person in that moment and say, yes, they should have a spiritual advisor, a counselor. Maybe all they have is their hand on their foot. All they have is their hand on the foot. But that's not for 1 second excusing the action that put them there.
Yeah.
And so, that's the thing, that when you're talking about Christ, I mean, while we were unworthy, he became flesh. I mean, he went through it all. He didn't wait for us to be worthy of that.
It feels like part of the mistake we make is we assume that empathy is opposed to justice,
Right.
when in fact empathy is opposed to cruelty.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
let's get into the heart of your piece, though, talks about, and the example of David fits here. We tend to be empathetic towards those that we identify with,
Yeah.
right? Those who are in our tribe, we have
Yes.
infinite empathy for. But anyone who's outside of our tribe, or heaven forbid, in the enemy's tribe, we have zero empathy for. So you argue that we don't have, the big problem in our culture today is not a sin of empathy. It's not an excessive amount of empathy, but it's
No.
too selective
Yeah.
in empathy. But it seems like the issue behind that is our tribalism.
Very much so.
So given the pluralism of our culture, the diversity of our culture, is it possible to overcome these tribal identities without some kind of massive external enemy? I mean, it feels to me like when I was a kid, we had a degree of that in the Cold War.
Yeah.
And I thought we would get that back maybe during the War on Terror, but that didn't seem to last very long. And then I thought maybe, I was so naive, when this pandemic hit, I thought maybe this will actually help bind the country together, because we're all
Yeah.
going to be facing this virus. But even that hasn't brought us together.
Here's the tragedy, Skye, because there is a community of millions of people in this country who, when the country is zigging towards tribalism, should be zagging away from it. When the country is zigging towards selective empathy, should be moving in the exact opposite direction. And that community of people is the community of people who've been told to weep with those who weep. A bruised reed he will not break. Love your enemies. Bless those who persecute you. I mean, we have the millions of us who are part of believers in Jesus Christ have been delivered the ultimate countercultural message for this moment. The ultimate countercultural message for this moment. And so in many ways, you could look at this tribalism and you could say, in a way, there's a moment where you say, this is our time. This is our time. Selective empathy? No, that's not us. We will go and hold the hand of our worst enemy as he struggles in a hospital. That's who we are. That's who we are in this tribal moment. And so that's sort of the hope of the gospel right there in a tribal moment. But the reality of the body of Christ right now in this tribal moment is all too often not only just participants in the tribalism. In many ways, we're the principal drivers of the tribalism.
Oh, that man is you, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Oh, I mean, what an indictment of Christian America. I mean, we have millions of Christians, as you say, thousands of churches, and yet you're right. In this moment, we've failed. It's a failure of discipleship. Um, you get into the article and talk about the sin of empathy. I'm using air quotes with that,
Right.
which is we've talked about on the Holy Post recently, Phil and I. Um, it feels a little bit to me like those in the church who are calling empathy a sin. It's like the church has an autoimmune disease. And the very thing we need in this moment, the very thing that should give us power and credibility as the people of Christ is our empathy. And yet here there are sections, at least of the white evangelical church, that are eating that empathy up and saying, no, we have to destroy it.
Yeah.
How do we fight an autoimmune disease in the church when it's telling us the very thing we need to survive in this moment is what's killing us?
Yeah. I mean, and there's so many examples from scripture that teach against this very impulse. And one that I wanted to put on my piece, and I can't, I even had it in my mind, Skye, how when you write, sometimes have a mental outline. And I just had this short circuit and I didn't include it.
That always
Is
comes to me
where
in the shower where I can't write it down.
Yeah, it was terrible. I wrote the piece, and then I published it, and then one of the first commenters gave me the analogy that I had thought of before and forgot to put in. We're a nation of Job's friends.
Yeah.
So, and what's happening is, so here's Job, he's suffering, and his friends come and sit with him, which is remarkable. What an incredible act of friendship. And then proceed to then spend all that while Job is suffering to, just vomit forth all of their supposed wisdom upon him.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all off. It was wrong. And so what you saw in a lot of this sort of sin of empathy talk was, well, okay, somebody's suffering, but we want to be at least in a position where we can tell them what they need to hear.
Because we
And
have it figured out.
so it's a bunch of Job's friends walking around. And again, that only really applies to our political opponents or people that we don't agree with. We want to be able to tell them what's what. I mean, we want to be nice to them, sure, but we also want to be able to forward them the Ben Shapiro clip. I mean, so it's a lot of Job's friendism going around, and a lot of people want to preserve that ability to tell people what's what. And one of the interesting things is, this has come up in the context of race and abuse and things that are hot button issues. And sadly, a lot of pastors even and leaders even who want to, still be able to sort of be in that position of tell the suffering person what the truth is, as I hear them talk about a lot of these issues, many of them which I know something about because of my professional life and my legal career, I'm thinking, you don't actually know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this analogy used. It's, well, you need to have one foot on the firm ground and one foot in the quicksand so you can pull the suffering person up out of the quicksand. I'm thinking, a lot of you guys, you just have your other foot in a whole different pile of quicksand. And you're just trying to yank somebody from one morass into the other morass and calling it progress.
But isn't that rooted, not to get psychological here, but isn't that rooted in our own desire to maintain a sense of righteousness and our own superiority, that I've got a foot on firm ground here and I can't question that or deny that or in any way give an inch on that because I have to be right.
It's not just I have to be right, especially when you're talking in pastoral circles. Sometimes it's I have to have some power.
Right. Yeah.
And there's this exchange that I talk about. There's this interview with Doug Wilson and Joe Rigney, and Rigney's talking about this very quicksand analogy that I was objecting to. And here's what Rigney says: if you're going to keep one foot on the shore, and I'm actually going to try to grab onto this big branch, and I'll step one foot in there with you and try to pull you out. That's sympathy. In other words, he's differentiating that from empathy, and that's helpful. But the person who's in there, it can feel like you're judging me. And then Wilson replies, so sympathy's clearly hierarchical.
Everything's hierarchical in their view.
Everything. And so you're thinking, wait, record scratch sound? What? What are you talking about? But which again goes back to this point, this sort of Job's friends point. Job's friends probably, if you were going to use that analogy in the middle of the dialogue with Job, would have said, right on. I've got my hand on the branch. I got my foot on the solid ground, and I'm trying to pull Job up out of this thing. But we, especially when we're dealing with these complicated issues of race and abuse and, the things that are tearing people's lives apart, and going back to the person dying or suffering in an ICU when they didn't get vaccinated, there's so much going on there. And sometimes what you need is somebody in the room, and here's what they're doing. They got their hand on your shoulder. They got their hand on your shoulder. And that's that. And they don't have necessarily wisdom. They have presence,
Right.
and they have love. And I feel like, if you're going to talk about the moment for Christians when people are so deeply suffering in this culture, and where that has even more power, is when that person who's suffering is maybe somebody who just torched you yesterday on social media. Is that, again, it's you're moving one way when the culture is moving another way, but sadly we're just moving with the culture.
The section you quoted about from Wilson and Rigney talking about compassion and having that foot on the solid ground, and the assumption behind that whole argument is that what's necessary to solve any problem is truth.
Mm-hmm.
And truth is massively important. I don't want to deny truth at all, but the idea that it's the answer to every problem is really naive. And I just had a conversation earlier today with somebody, an interview for the podcast, Jamie Ivey. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she has her own podcast. She's a mom of 4 kids, 3 of whom are adopted and are kids of color. And she said something that almost knocked me off my chair when I asked her, what would you go back and tell yourself now? They're all teenagers, her kids. What would you go back and tell yourself now before you adopted those kids that you wish you had known that you didn't? And she said, essentially, I wish I had been told that love can't solve everything. And it was a beautiful statement, but her realization that love is an incredibly powerful and good thing. But anyone who's a parent of a teenager, adopted or not, knows no matter how much you love a kid, it doesn't solve everything.
Right.
And I think some of these folks, especially in the more conservative neo-fundamentalist side, really believe truth solves everything. And it doesn't.
Yes.
There are some problems, like sitting at someone's bedside as they're dying, which I've done as a pastor, I've done as a chaplain.
Yes.
Like, truth isn't going to solve anything at that moment. It is presence. It's something else. That's what Job's friends didn't figure out either. But I do wonder if some of these people who are advocating the sin of empathy idea are just like, are they just emotionally unavailable? Are they are they on some kind of spectrum where they can't empathize, and so they're just trying to condemn the whole idea of empathy because they're not really capable of it, and they just think cognitive knowledge is all that's necessary for a flourishing life?
Well, in fairness, like, Joe has written other things that have sort of modified a lot of what he says, and it sort of kind of boils down to what I really meant is there's good empathy is good, bad empathy is bad. It's really kind of hard to sort of figure out the lines right, once you look at the totality after the first initial writings that he did that kind of caught fire on their own. But I do think you're hitting on something right on this truth point. And what I would say on that is two things. One is, and this sort of gets to neo-fundamentalism itself, and I'm not calling Rigney that, but let's just circle back. Some kind of gets to one of the problems that I had when I was growing up in a what anybody would clearly identify as a fundamentalist kind of environment, is truth was seen as everything, and people didn't know the truth. And so the truth was seen as everything. And then yet the more I learned about scripture, the more I learned about history, the more I learned that a lot of what was being told to me as here is the truth wasn't all that true. And so this is one of the reasons why I kind of rebel against this idea that says, hey, I'm the guy with one foot on the shore. Are you sure about that? Are you really
Right.
sure? And one of the things that really, to me, helped me really see the difference and to really move from that sort of fundamentalist world into the more ecumenical evangelical world, which in my experience was much more comfortable with doubt.
Mm-hmm.
much more comfortable with disagreement, was the phrase, "We see through a glass darkly.
Yeah.
We know in part."
1 Corinthians 13.
Yes, we see through a glass darkly. We know in part, and that aha. So, in one sense, that's both humbling because as much as you might think you know, you're still seeing darkly. At the other hand, it's also liberating. The idea that I could know all that needs to be known, or that I'm responsible to know all that needs to be known. What a burden! What an unbelievable burden! And
Indeed.
so I feel like there has to be a comfort with doubt. There just has to be.
Yeah, that the value of certainty is definitely a quality that marks fundamentalisms of all kind, not just Christian
Yes. Oh,
fundamentalism,
for
but
sure.
any kind. And going back to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast and the narrative that we're all getting a glimpse of there, I remember running into guys when I was in seminary and just out of seminary who were huge fans of Mark Driscoll and that ministry, and I would always ask them, what's so appealing to you? And they would always say, well, he says the truth. He's saying the
Mhm.
truth and he doesn't care how it's received. He's just truth. It was all about truth. And after I heard that a number of times, it dawned on me that Paul doesn't list truth among the fruit of the Spirit.
Right.
It's love, joy, peace, patience. And I'm not saying truth isn't important. It very
Right.
much
Of
is
course.
important. But just because somebody is able to articulate what you even think is doctrinally true, if they don't exhibit the fruit of the Spirit,
Yep.
there's a big problem. And going back to what you said at the very beginning when we were talking about the SBC and the executive committee, like character
Yeah.
is what is irreplaceable
Yeah.
in building trust. And so all this talk about the sin of empathy and the importance of truth and having one foot on solid ground or whatever. Okay, but if you're all about truth and you don't show me those other pieces, which, yeah, Paul doesn't use the word empathy there, but all the qualities of empathy are listed in the
Yeah.
fruit of the Spirit, like something's broken, something's missing. David, before you go, just briefly, what are you working on that we should keep our eyes open for in the coming days or weeks? Are there stories or issues that you hope to tackle that we can?
Check out thedispatch.com. You can put your toe in the water for free. And if you do for free, you'll get my Sunday essays that Skye and I have talked about. And also, I have a legal podcast. If you just have a little bit of a legal nerd itch you want to scratch, it's called Advisory Opinions. But other than that, I unlike you, Skye, I don't have a book in the works right now.
Okay, well, you are writing a lot, so you're putting plenty out there. And I started by putting my toe in the water with your Sunday columns at the Dispatch, and I quickly took my other foot off of firm ground and just jumped in. And I'm a supporter. I'm a subscriber. I love the Dispatch. You guys are doing fantastic work. David, thank you for your time and your wisdom. And I enjoy our conversations a ton, and I hope other people benefit from them.
Well, thanks so much, Skye. I love talking to you, love talking to Phil, and I'm honored to be here.
All right. Well, until next time, see ya.
See ya.
French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of the Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.